We're in our fourth year of In Their Honor. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, I heard from grandparents, aunts and uncles, religious school teachers, never again. It was critical. We were still sort of right on the cusp of the Holocaust in the 60s and 70s. We do this program because we're far from the cusp of it. But when we talk about never again, the idea is not just that we don't ever put in death camps, but we're not scared to death in our homes, in our synagogues, in our community gathering halls, on the streets of where we live. So if you wonder what can we do, you're doing it. Right now you've gathered. You said, Hineni, I am here, and I'm willing to stand up to tyranny by just saying I care to hear about what's happened in the past. Because when we learn about what happened in the past, we hopefully prevent that from ever happening in the future. So thank you for coming and being here. Thank you could be no greater than to you, Steen Metz, because you've been through what most of us have learned through these interviews, a hell on earth that we all wonder, how could you possibly survive it? How could you get through a Holocaust, a death camp experience? Because most of us think we could never do that. And what I've learned interviewing the people I've interviewed is nobody got through the Holocaust, but you got through moments at a time that became the Holocaust. So it is sharing those moments with us that we're grateful for you being willing and brave enough to do it and strong enough to do it, because we can only imagine the horrors of what it is to have gone through it, and you come out optimistic, healthy, and willing to share. What we'd like to learn first about those we get to talk to in this series is what life was like for you before the evil started to happen. What was your childhood like?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I think it's more important, as we talked about earlier, than ever before, that we never forget the Holocaust, especially based on the latest occurrence. My life before the Holocaust, before the Second World War, was very normal. I was 5 years old when Hitler invaded Denmark. Prior to that, I would go to kindergarten. Fortunately, I have some very fond memories of my father, which is very important to me, especially since, as you heard earlier, I lost my father during the Holocaust.
What was his name?
His name was Axel, A-X-E-L.
What did he do for a living?
He was an attorney. He was practicing law.
And you were only child?
I was the only child, yes.
Cousins?
Big family, aunts, uncles, cousins, and cousins.
Did you gather for religious holidays?
No, we did not. I was not brought up in the Jewish faith. Both my parents were Jewish. My father was brought up in the Jewish faith. My mother was not. And we lived in a town where we didn't have a temple or synagogue. Just about all the Jewish people, I think close to 95% at that time, lived on the East Coast in the capital of Copenhagen.
So almost by definition, you weren't Jewish. You wouldn't think enough to be caught up in the Nazi net, but you were. How did it start?
Oh, I didn't realize how we got arrested and how they found out about our names until much later on. There were some German families living close by, and I'm very ashamed to say for years I thought they had been informers. They were not informers. When I started researching my book in 2009, I found out that the Nazis in Denmark found out about our names and addresses. They had all the information. They stole it. They broke into the Jewish congregation in Copenhagen, got the names, addresses, phone numbers, everything they needed. And my family, while we didn't practice Judaism, we were part of the congregation.
So when they started to gather, the soldiers first came into town, do you remember what went through your mind or what your parents said to you about what was happening?
I couldn't quite understand it, why I referred to the soldiers in the ugly green uniforms, and they were very intimidating. And I remember I would be bicycling to and from school every day into town. and I would try to avoid them. They never physically harmed me. They never touched me, but they looked very, very intimidating. It was very difficult at that time. In the beginning of the war, I was 5 years old, and I started going to first grade the following year. And it was difficult at that age to fully understand what was going on. And what was amazing, especially when I look back, is the fact that our conditions that we lived under, despite being occupied by the Germans, our conditions were what I would refer to relatively normal, certainly compared to what happened in Czechoslovakia or Poland or Hungary.
When they first captured you, it was October 2nd. It was Rosh Hashanah.
Yes.
So were you doing anything different for Rosh Hashanah that day?
We didn't celebrate the Jewish holidays. We didn't practice the Jewish faith. We were home. And the Germans thought that they had planned it so well because they figured all the Jewish families would be home. Fortunately, and I didn't realize that for years, there was a Nazi that got word about the arrest date, leaked it to the Jewish congregation in Copenhagen, and as a result, 7,500 Jewish people managed to escape to Sweden, most of them from Copenhagen. The Danish people, the non-Jewish people in Copenhagen, I refer to them as bystanders, upstanders, the opposite of bystanders. They really stood up for what they thought were right, and they were hiding the Jewish families in their homes, they were hiding in hospitals, they were hiding in churches, and eventually in fishing boats they reached Sweden, and Sweden was a neutral country.
So when they came and captured you, they take you from your home?
Yes.
To where?
Initially they took us to the schoolyard in town, and later on we were taken to the western part of Denmark, and we were literally shoveled into a cattle car, and we were deported from my hometown, Odense, you may call it Odense, and we ended up in Theresienstadt. At that time it was Czechoslovakia, today it is the Czech Republic. It took us more than 3 days and 3 nights to reach our destination.
And prior to going to the camp, you were with your mom and dad the whole time? You weren't separated from them, were you?
Before we were arrested, oh no, we didn't have any, I was home. It was relatively normal living conditions prior to the arrest.
And in the camp, were you separated from them?
Oh, we were separated. I was separated from my father. But it was very, very unusual. I stayed with my mother, and I'll never understand how she was able to persuade the authorities for me to stay with her, but I did. And I spent 18 long, long months with my mother, and I think that helped me a great deal.
Were any other members of your family in the camp with you?
My entire family lived in Copenhagen. A younger brother, my father, his wife, and their younger son, and my father's mother, they were in hiding in a hotel on the coast just north of Copenhagen. They were arrested and they were sent to Theresienstadt. But the rest of the family, uncles, aunts, and several cousins, they managed to escape to Sweden, and they spent the entire time in Sweden. It's amazing how time felt long, long. Like we were in camp for 18 months, and one day was as bad as the next. And just to give you an idea, like in the morning we would line up for what was called breakfast, which was substitute coffee, more water than coffee, half a loaf of bread for the rest of the week. Then we would line up for lunch again, At lunch, it seemed to me that we got potato soup, and potato soup. Except all there was boiled water with potato peel. And then at dinner we would line up again, get a different kind of soup, quite often barley soup. In addition to that, about once a week we got a special pasta dish. So I've always been very fond of food, I still am. And it seems to me that I probably went to bed hungry just about every night.
And as we look back and said, we know about the totality of the Holocaust, but When you were in a camp there, did you have any idea about the rest of the war?
No.
Did your parents?
I don't know to what extent they knew about the rest of the world, probably not very much. Quite frankly, we were more concerned about ourselves. Would we make it another day? Would we get enough food to eat? Would we be deported to an extermination camps? And communications were so different in those days. And I don't know that my mother and father knew very much about what happened outside of the camp.
And between the meals of the day in that 18 months, what did they have you do?
Being 8 years old, when I started in camp, I didn't have to work. If you were 15 years or older, it was slave labor. But I became a messenger. My mother thought it would be a good idea, time would go a little faster. So there isn't much you can do when you're 8 or 9 years old. And my role was to be a messenger. And I would take documents and messages from one Nazi office to the other. And I would do that for a couple of hours in the morning and for about an hour in the afternoon.
Do you remember, were you scared?
I was scared. I was especially frightened when I went to one Nazi office to the other. They looked very, very intimidating. They never touched me, never harmed me. Like my father was physically abused many times, but I never was.
And your father died 6 months into the 18 months that you were there. What was that like, especially for your mother? How did you see her change?
I think it must have been even more difficult for my mother. Being 8 years old, I'm not so sure I fully appreciate it. It was very hard for me, having lost a father when I was such a young age. My parents had been married for about 10 years, and to be a single parent under those awful conditions must have been very, very difficult. And apparently my mother told me he lost about half his weight. I told you about the lack of food, and he basically died of starvation, hunger.
After he passed away, were you treated differently by the guards? Did they?
No, I wasn't treated any different.
And in that last year, life was pretty much like it was in the first 6 months for you?
One day was about as bad as the other, very, very similar, lining up for food. But also I had when I look back, it's surprising that I was able to enjoy myself. And in between lining up for food and working as a messenger, I played soccer with some Czech friends. I made some good friends. I learned the Czech language phonetically, so we were able to communicate. We didn't have a real soccer field, we didn't have a real soccer ball, but I was still able to have a good time. And that was probably the only time that I really felt like the way a 9-year-old boy should feel and enjoy himself.
When we spoke the other day about what the experience was like and what I should talk with you about, you said the worst part was not knowing what was happening next, and that was what every day was like.
We didn't know whether we would get ill. We tried to keep clean. We didn't know if we would get typhus. We didn't know whether we would live another day, get enough food, as I mentioned earlier. Would we be deported to an extermination camp? I mean, all these things were hanging over you.
And was there threats or talk of sending you to different camps?
There was never talk, as far as I'm concerned, there was never threat about sending us to any concentration camp. I didn't know the actual facts. There was an agreement between Adolf Eichmann and the German commandant in Denmark not to send any Danes to any extermination camps. They were very, very concerned. They wanted to make sure they got a continuous flow of supply of Danish food products, which was shipped down to Germany, and we fed the troops in Denmark also. And they were afraid that resistance movement would be so bad as far as the Germans were concerned if they sent Danes to Therese instead. But we didn't know about it. I think my mother went to her grave not knowing that there were no threat. So the threat was there every day. I didn't know about it until I started doing research for my book.
When the experience was ending, the 18 months period, how were you made aware of it? What happened to when you got freed? Where'd you go?
We were freed by the white buses. It took us to Sweden. We went up through Germany. The war was still going on. There was still heavy bombardment. I remember that. I was almost 10 at the time. And we went up through Denmark. We were not allowed to stay in Denmark. Denmark was still occupied. We went over to Sweden. And they were very, very good to open up the borders for so many Jewish people. And other saboteurs went to Sweden also. And we spent about a month there. The first week we were in quarantine. They wanted to make sure we didn't bring in any illnesses. And then later on, the war ended on May the 5th, 1945. And that was a very big day. Not only did the Germans surrender, but May the 5th was also my birthday. And the flag was flying ever since then on May the 5th. And I would always tell my friends, you know why they're flying the flag today? It's to celebrate my birthday.
Did you and your mom talk about the experiences?
Very limited. People were very good. They didn't ask too many questions. Not that they weren't interested. My mother would always say, ask her questions. She didn't want me to be in any greater pain than necessary. She wanted to look ahead, but you never forget it. And it's very typical that liberators and survivors don't talk very much about it. And the conversation between my mother and I was very, very limited. And when I wrote my book, I wish I could have borrowed my mother because I had some questions to ask her. But obviously that wasn't feasible.
Many of us, again, when we hear these stories, you think, what would it be like if it was us? And a lot of us, I think I don't know how I'd let go of the anger that I was put through this experience, especially if I'd lost a parent. But you told me in the aftermath, all these years, there isn't anger. How do you think you're past being angry about this?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe I misspoke because I think there was a great deal of anger at that time because I could never, when I was in camp, later on I understood it, but why was I in camp? Why wasn't my neighbor in camp? Why weren't we in Sweden? Why were we in camp? So I think there was a great deal of anger for a number of years, but life had to go on. And I was lucky enough to get back to my school and my old friends, and I went into my old class. So I think that helped transform the change from camp to normal life.
Did many of the people who your friends get through the war so you saw them afterwards? Did you lose a lot of people in your town?
Didn't lose anybody in town because there were very few Jewish people in town. There was another Jewish family that we were friends with. They managed to escape to Sweden. But like Jewish people that I've talked to, if they came from Czechoslovakia, or if they came from Hungary, they lost a lot of people. It was different in Denmark because about 95% of the Jewish people ended up in Sweden. So it's a very, very unique situation.
At some point in your life, you went on to study and get degrees and work. You decided to start speaking out. Why?
I started speaking out in the fall of 2011. I hadn't planned to talk about it, but I finished my book, and friends, of course, started reading the book, started asking questions. But I thought I had finished my job, but I started little by little to open up. And then my oldest daughter had a son, my grandson, in 8th grade in the suburb of Chicago, and she talked to the school teacher. And they thought it would be a good idea if I came in to talk to the school, 8th graders. I was very hesitant. I wasn't used to talking to students. I talked to business people. But I agreed to do it, although I was hesitant. I didn't know how the students would behave. I didn't know if they would be fiddling with their phone, would they be talking. But they were very, very good. Afterwards, my daughter thought it went well. I was quite happy, and was especially happy that my grandson, who at that time was very introvert, started asking questions. And the students were very, very attentive, very, very engaged. And then later on, I heard from my grandson that a friend of his said, "Your grandpa was just awesome." And that kind of became the beginning, that kind of clinched it, and that became the beginning of my second career in education.
Our young students here, that it is your job to be ambassadors for those who survived the Holocaust, who will no longer be here a decade or 2 decades from now.
When I talk to groups, mostly students, and I'm glad to see so many young people here today, I think that's very important. I ask each person, and I would like to ask each person in this room also, be my ambassador, talk to at least 4 people. I always remind the students, don't necessarily stop with 4. Tell them you know the Holocaust took place. There's going to be a time, 10 years from now, maybe, none of us, we're a dwindling population, none of us will be able to talk about the Holocaust. And I'm hoping that future generations will be able to carry the message forward. And I'm amazed, I get thousands of letters from students, especially middle school students. And more times than none, they make reference to my talk. And they talk about how they want to be an upstander. But they also tell me that they have already talked to 4 people. And I don't know exactly how many of them will talk to people, but I'm encouraged. I'll never forget, I got a postcard, or letter actually, from my mother, and the son, an 8th grader, had spent most of the time that evening at dinner talking about the Holocaust. So I'm hopeful and optimistic as far as the new generation is concerned.
What's the most important question somebody who is a young person who talks to you can ask you?
How can anybody deny that the Holocaust took place? I generally say they're crazy. Anybody who denies it, they're crazy. I'm often asked, did you ever have an opportunity to talk to anybody who denied? Unfortunately, no. There are more and more. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, and I can go on and on. You all know what's going on.
Is there anything somebody can't ask you?
No. I tend to ask all the questions. I always enjoy answering questions from students and from the audience here. I welcome questions. I normally say they're all good questions, there are no bad questions. As far as I'm concerned, they can ask personal questions. If it becomes a little too personal, I'll tell them. I think it has helped me heal. I think it has helped me get closure. I get very inspired.
One of us.
Not that inspired.
No?
But I get very inspired from the students' questions. And especially middle school are my favorite because they're totally uninhibited and they ask so many great questions. I'll never forget, one of my favorite questions was, an 8th grader a few years ago asked, do I feel guilty or lucky being alive today? And for an 8th grader, I thought that was a pretty deep question. What was the question? Did I feel guilty or lucky being alive today? And I answered it, maybe I should feel guilty, but I certainly feel very, very lucky being alive. As Shai said earlier, or less than 10% of the children in Theresienstadt was liberated, so I'm indeed very lucky. And I think it's not just my job, but it's a passion of mine to talk to people and have an opportunity to be here in the Milwaukee area this morning.
Some of the questions our audience want to ask you. Do you wish you had started talking about your experiences earlier?
In retrospect, yes. I don't think I could have talked about it 20 years ago, but I wish I had started spreading the word much sooner. The soonest would probably have been when I retired, because I had a full-time job and couldn't have been speaking to students. So yes, I wish I had started earlier.
So, by the way, we didn't talk a lot about your career, but you talked about going through the Holocaust and the horrible experience of not being fed. Do you see the irony that you then went into the food industry for a career?
Yeah, I think it's quite ironic. My wife always says everybody has to eat, so they're always going to buy food. Maybe subconsciously I stayed in the food business all my life because I wanted to make sure that I didn't go to bed hungry. But I've been in the food business all my life, and I've enjoyed it.
And you're so slender.
I'm sorry?
You're so slender.
Oh, you're very kind.
The next question someone asked me to ask you is, can you describe in detail what it was like to be liberated? What happened when you were liberated?
Oh, up to that point, maybe my whole life, it was the happiest moment of my life. But we didn't feel being freed just because we were in the white buses, had to drive up through Germany and then over through Denmark and then over to Sweden. But we were finally free. We didn't have all the green uniforms around us. We were able to go to a regular washroom. We were able to go to a regular shower. We were able to get food. And I didn't feel completely free, and neither did my mother, until we actually returned to Denmark.
A question about how many people ended up going to Sweden and why you and your family didn't get there. Do you know how many people made it there? And
yeah.
Was it an option for your
there
family?
There were 8,000 Jewish people. 7,500 ended up in Sweden. I think I mentioned, or at least I meant to, they were alerted by a Nazi about the arrest date. We lived in the middle of the country, and communications were quite different in those days. And as I remind the students, we didn't even have TV in those days. We didn't have a smartphone. The phone lines were cut off. To my knowledge, my family had not been warned. And most of the people that ended up in concentration camp, fewer than 500, or about 5% of the Jewish population, they were from outside the Copenhagen area.
Question about how the war affected how you felt about Germans as a young boy once you were out, and as a man throughout your life.
For many, many years, I held a grudge against Germany and the Germans. I couldn't distinguish between Nazis and Germans. They weren't all bad. I didn't really change my attitude until I started writing my book. I was thinking there may be a young man or young woman, maybe in this audience, that was born in Germany, or maybe their parents were German. They had nothing to do with it. Maybe their grandfather, great-grandfather, they might have been a Nazi, but they had nothing to do with it. So I really changed, and I think that's healthy, changed my attitude completely against the Germans. If I was to meet a Nazi, it's not very likely because they're not alive anymore, I would feel completely different. So what was amazing after I changed my attitude, there were three separate instances. There was high school students that came up to me after my talk. They were in tears. They told me how guilty they felt because their great-grandfather was a Nazi. And I tried to comfort them and said, you had nothing to do with it. So that was kind of a long way, but it was an evolution. But the Nazis completely different. I would never, and I would sometimes ask, could I ever forgive the Nazis? And I know it's the right thing to forgive, but after what they did to my father and millions of others, there's no way I could forgive the Nazis.
Throughout your life, How has your experience affected your actions? So obviously now you're talking about it, but as a young man and a young husband and father, there's certain things you did in your life that you look back on now and you did it because of the experience?
I'm surprised the minimum impact it had on me. I do remember though that on my second date, which was in Toronto, it must have been serious because I told my girlfriend at that time I was Jewish, because it was serious obviously, and I wanted her to know right away. Normally I would not do that. I think if I'd been older, it would have been more difficult. I think from a physical point of view, my mother's nerves suffered. In addition to that, her hearing suffered. So my impact, I was overall, I was very lucky. The impact was amazingly not that great. I even went back to Theresienstadt to do some research for my book. My wife was very concerned that I would go, but I'm glad I went. It was important for me, and it was a lot worse for my wife. She had to sit outside while I was inside in the museum.
What was it like to go back?
It was amazing. It was much bigger. It looked much bigger than I remember it. I recognized where I played soccer. Obviously, I recognized where we stayed. I spent several hours in the museum. I was in the archives. And then I saw a memorial, and I will never forget the place where we had a memorial. There were children my age. We had been ordered to form a human chain and take urns from the crematorium, ashes of dead bodies, and pass them on to other children, eventually throw them in to the river, and that came back. But overall, I'm glad I went back, and I thought it was very helpful.
So you stood in a line linked with other children, and you passed ashes all the way down the line to throw the ashes into the river.
That's what we were ordered to do. Wow. And I had forgotten all about it until I saw the memorial.
One of the other questions somebody wanted to know is, what other activities did you do in the camps besides being a messenger and playing soccer? Obviously, the tossing of the ashes was one of those things. Yeah. Was there anything else that stands out that we should know?
I would play with other children, but the days were quite short because there was a curfew, and I think by 7 o'clock, we had to be back in the barracks.
Do you have a connection with other Holocaust survivors?
I'm on the Speakers Bureau, which was mentioned earlier, in the Holocaust Museum in Skokie, and there are about 50 people on the Speakers Bureau there, and I'm in contact with other survivors. And I find it interesting. There was a time I didn't want to talk about it. My mother and I didn't talk very much about it. Now I cannot talk enough about it. Now I cannot learn enough about it. And I compare notes with other survivors.
Question about how the Holocaust experience connected you to being Jewish. Are you a practicing Jew now? And does it have anything to do with the Holocaust?
I'm not a practicing Jew. I married a Christian person. She's from England. But I identify a lot more with the Jewish people than ever before. Life could have been very, very different, and it would have been different if my father had survived. I know I would have been bar mitzvahed. I know I would have been brought up in the Jewish faith. And maybe instead of ending up in the food business, I might have been an attorney, just like my father.
And the rest of your family, the cousins, the aunts and uncles, did many of them survive?
They all survived. The only one that didn't survive was my father.
The only one.
And most of them were in Sweden, so the whole family survived, which, as we talked about earlier, was very, very unique, because most survivors will tell you they lost their parents, they lost their cousins, they lost their uncles and aunts. So it was very unusual in my case.
And you have 2 daughters?
I have 2 daughters, I have 4 grandchildren, and I think I talked a little more to my daughters about my experience. They certainly knew about it than to my mother. But the 4 grandchildren, they probably know more at their age than their mothers, because they read my book and they have studied it at school. It's mandatory in the state of Illinois. I know it doesn't mean that it's not taught in Wisconsin. And I've been to all their schools, and especially my oldest granddaughter, she's very interested in it.
When the news comes out about shootings in Pittsburgh and Poway and Sri Lanka and Oak Creek, Wisconsin, what does that tell you about what the world has done in terms of progress or lack thereof since World War II?
Lack of progress. There's too much hatred out there. After the news came out about Pittsburgh, I was in Davenport talking. Now another murder yesterday in San Diego, and I'm in Milwaukee. It's just absolutely terrible. And how have we not learned from the past? And it goes well beyond the murder in the synagogues. I mean, look at the genocide. And the word is often used, never again, which is a wonderful attitude to have, but unfortunately, it's not happening. And you have genocide right now in Syria, you had it in Africa, you had it in the old Yugoslavia.
What do you think both individuals, like everyone here, can do to fight back? And maybe as importantly or more importantly, our political and governmental leaders, what can they do?
I think education is very important. I think talking about it like we're doing today, trying to bring it to the attention of many people. I like the word upstander. I'm starting to use that a lot. I think there are too many bystanders standing by, looking the other way. We need less hatred in this world. We need more discussion, more compromise.
And to help you, so you don't have to feel you're doing the shameless plug about your book, I'll help you do it. So the title of the book is
I just happen to have
You just happen to have it. A Danish-born in Theresienstadt, Reflections of a Holocaust Survivor. And people can see it, they can buy it, they can read it. Ultimately, you wrote a book with the message of what in it?
The message, there's only one reason why I wrote the book. I wanted future generations always to remember the Holocaust. And I sometimes draw a comparison. And there was a terrible genocide taking place a little over 100 years ago. There were 1.5 million Armenians that were murdered by the Turks. Today, there's not a single survivor that can talk for herself or for himself. The Turks are denying that it ever took place. And I want to make sure that in about 10 years, or maybe 15 years, if we are lucky, that won't happen to the Holocaust. I think that's very important.
Steen Metz, thank you so much.